All right, section 2 in chapter 15 is entitled Stabilization Policies. And in this section, we're going to look at what can be done to stabilize or fix the economy when it's not doing what it's supposed to. When the economy is in a recession or when we're experiencing rapid inflation, what can be done? Okay? And there are three basic policies, one of which we already learned before, monetary policy. We'll go over that again at the end of the section. But the other two things that can be done are what we call demand side policies and supply side policies. Okay? And these are things that the government can enact. Okay? Demand side policies are based upon the economic ideas of a very famous economist, probably the most famous economist of the 20th century, a gentleman by the name of John Maynard Keynes. It's pronounced Keynes. And Keynesian economics is based upon this formula that we learned back in chapter 12. And this formula says that everything that our economy creates, every good, service, and structure that our economy creates is purchased. Okay, this is the output. Who is spending the money to buy that output? Okay? The consumer sector represents about 70%. So we as consumers, we buy about 70% of the GDP that is created in our country. The I stands for the investment sector or the businesses. The G is the government and the F is the foreign sector. Now before we used X minus M, but it still stands for the foreign sector. We use the letter F here. Okay? And Keynes said that if we're having a recession, if the economy is going downhill, that is, if GDP is going down, and that's what a recession is, right? Real GDP is going down. If real GDP is going down, that means something on this side of the equation must be going down. Okay? And so he said, well, it's not the consumers. Consumers spend a very stable amount of money based upon how much they have after taxes. So it's not the consumers. He says it's not the government. The government spends a very stable amount of money every year based upon what they collect in taxes. Okay? And again, you have to remember that he was putting forth his ideas in the early 1900s, 1900, 1920, into the 1930s. In fact, it was his ideas that helped get us out of the Great Depression. Okay? So he said it's not the consumers and it's not the government. And he said the foreign sector is so small you don't even have to worry about it. Well, that was, again, almost 100 years ago, or around 100 years ago. And so that was a true statement back then. Today, the foreign sector is much larger. Okay? But the concept is still the same. He said, it's not this that's going down, it's not this, it's not this. So that leaves, obviously, the businesses or the investment sector are spending less money. If GDP is going down, it's because the investment sector or businesses are spending less money. So Keynes blamed the businesses or the investment sector for all recessions. He said they've cut back. Okay? And then what happens when they cut back is it tends to ripple, or he used the term multiply, throughout the economy. If businesses cut back, like they are today in this pandemic recession, as the businesses have closed down and have cut back their spending, a lot of workers are getting laid off. And as the workers get laid off, they have fewer dollars to spend, so that causes consumer spending to go down. Okay? As the consumers and businesses are now making less money, they're going to pay less in taxes. And as they pay less in taxes, that means government spending is going to go down. Okay? So he said it starts with the business sector, but then it multiplies. I like to use the term ripple. But it ripples or multiplies out on the other sectors of the economy, and then it begins to feed on itself. Okay? He called this the accelerator. So businesses started, they cut back. That causes consumer spending to go down. Now consumers are spending less money, so what do you think the businesses are going to do again? They're going to cut back even more. So more businesses are going to cut back spending. And then that's going to lay off more workers and reduce less tax or create less tax dollars. And so it's going to accelerate through the economy. Okay? So Keynes and Keynesian economics says any and all recessions are started and caused by the investment sector. Okay? Who did he put the blame, I shouldn't say he put the blame on the businesses, but who did he put the onus on to try to fix the economy? Who did Keynes believe had to fix the economy because the businesses started it? Well, he said only the government is big enough to fix it. He said the government needs to implement a fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. And fiscal policy, as you can see in the definition in the book, refers to the government's spending and taxing plans so as to influence economic activity. And they're based upon the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. Fiscal policies are demand-side policies because they're designed to move the aggregate demand curve. And I'm going to show you a graph here in a few moments. Okay? But fiscal policy involves the government doing two specific things to try to help the economy get better. First, Keynes said the government can take a direct role in the economy by spending more themselves. So instead of the government spending less, the government needs to step in and spend more to make up for the fact that the businesses are not spending. And this is exactly what happened during the Great Depression. As you remember from your history classes, the government went out and spent a lot of money on the New Deal, building roads and bridges and dams and bringing electricity to the Tennessee Valley. It's exactly what the government is doing now. They're spending money in unemployment benefits. They're spending money in stimulus money, or by giving out stimulus money. So Keynes wanted the government to spend more, directly impacting the economy. In fact, President Trump has talked about when the pandemic is over, working on infrastructure. Let's do a lot like the New Deal. Let's rebuild the roads. Let's rebuild bridges and build dams, and that will create jobs and help the economy grow. The other thing Keynes wanted the government to do is to lower taxes. By lowering taxes, that will put more money in the consumer's hands, and they would turn around and spend more money. And so, if the businesses are spending less, it was up to the government to fix the economy by spending more themselves and cutting taxes. And that would cause the economy to go back the other direction. Okay? Keynesian economics dominated much of the 20th century. Keynes's ideas were responsible for getting us out of the Great Depression. And for many years, whenever the economy was in bad shape, the government would implement fiscal policies that increased government spending and lowered taxes. You probably can surmise one of the consequences, one of the negative consequences of Keynesian economics. If the government is spending more but taxing less, what's that going to do to the federal deficit? It's going to make the deficit grow. And we're going to have the largest deficit we've ever had in the history of this country because of the pandemic recession. Okay? The government is going to be spending lots of money. They're going to be getting a lot less in taxes because people aren't doing as well. And so the deficit is going to get huge. So one of the negative consequences of the deficit, of Keynesian economics, is the deficit getting larger. What does this do for macroeconomic equilibrium? As we learned in the last section, macroeconomic equilibrium is the intersection of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves, where they come together. Well, if this point is not where we want it, if the economy is going down and we're in a recession, what could the government do? They could increase government spending, and that would create jobs. Okay? They could lower taxes, and that would help people have more money in their pocket. And in both of those instances, they would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. And what does that do to the equilibrium? It causes real GDP to go up. And that was the whole point. Let's try to get real GDP, instead of going down and being in a recession, let's get real GDP to change direction and start going up. Okay? So Keynesian economics is designed to shift the aggregate demand curve using fiscal policy. Okay? One of the negative consequences of Keynesian economics is that it does cause deficits. But what else, as you can see from this graph, and the same graph that we used last section, is it does cause prices to rise. And that's one of the consequences of Keynesian economics. But we're willing to let prices rise a little bit if we can get the economy going back in the right direction, get the economy growing, get people back to work, and raise people's standard of living. Okay? So Keynesian economics said when the economy is doing poorly, it's because the businesses are spending less, and that multiplies out on the rest of the economy. Keynes said it's the government that's got to fix it. It's up to the government to implement a fiscal policy that lowers taxes and increases government spending. Increased government spending could be building dams, could be stimulus money. Okay? One of the things that the book talks about is something called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are government programs that automatically kick in when the economy starts to go bad, like unemployment benefits. That's the perfect example. Okay? When people lose their job and the government starts to spend more money on unemployment benefits, that's designed to offset or make up for the fact that the businesses are spending less. The other thing that the government can do is lower taxes to allow the consumers to spend more. Okay? So these are all demand side policies. Okay? Based upon the work of John Maynard Keynes, or Keynesian economics we call it, okay? We use that formula. Okay? So he blamed the businesses, but he said it was the government that's got to fix it. Okay? But as you can see from this graph, one of the negative consequences is that prices do rise. So what can be done to try to fix that? Well, by the 1970s, prices were rising way too much. Okay? For much of your high school career, the inflation rate has been just 1 or 2%. When I was in high school, the inflation rate was 11, 12, even up to 14% a year. And that was a problem. So Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. Yeah, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And he said, instead of trying to fix the economy by shifting the aggregate demand curve, what if we could somehow shift the aggregate supply curve? So again, we're going to create macroeconomic equilibrium, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, price levels. What if, according to Reagan and his economic policymakers, what if we could, instead of shifting the aggregate demand curve, what if we could shift aggregate supply? What if we could get the supply of all goods and services to go up? At this new equilibrium, what would occur? Well, the first thing we would see is that real GDP would be going up. That's good. That means the recession will be ending. As we produce more goods and services, the output of goods and services going up, the recession is ending. And as you can see from this graph, it would also create downward pressure on prices. Okay? This would cause prices to go down. Again, this assumes that there's no shift in the aggregate demand curve, but it would cause prices to try to come down. And so in order to fight that inflation that I experienced in my high school years, President Reagan implemented what we call supply-side policies. The media called them Reaganomics. You may have heard of that in your history class. But supply-side policies were implemented by Ronald Reagan. He did not invent them. He was an actor before he became a politician. But he did, his government, his presidency did implement these supply-side policies, which were designed to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, making output go up and price levels come down. And how would they do that? Well, a couple of things. First of all, they wanted the government to get less involved. Supply-siders want the government to get less involved in the economy, fewer regulatory agencies. And if you remember way back in chapter 5, government regulations like the health department codes or the fact that they have to put seat belts and airbags in automobiles, those make it more expensive to produce items. I'm not saying we shouldn't have those things, but the more government regulation we have, the more expensive it is to produce goods and services. So the government, supply-siders want the government to get less involved. They want them to use a process called deregulation. And that means to take away a lot of these rules and restrictions. And that would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. The other thing they wanted them to do was to lower taxes. Okay? That sounds a lot like a demand side policy, but it was a different philosophical idea. The supply-siders feel that taxes discourage people from producing more goods and services. So what the supply-siders do is they want to see lower taxes, but they start by lowering taxes on the people at the top and on businesses. And this was very controversial when President Reagan did it, when they lowered taxes on the rich and on the business owners. If that sounds familiar, that's exactly what President Trump did early in his presidency as well. He implemented supply-side policies and deregulation, where he lowered taxes on the rich and the businesses. And the argument that was made by President Reagan and by President Trump, you might have heard it back in your history classes. The idea that the tax cut for the rich would eventually make its way down to the person on the bottom. As a rich business owner, if I get a tax break, I'm going to make more money, so now I can afford to hire more workers, and now that person at the bottom is going to get a job. Or I can afford to pay my workers more, so that worker is going to get a pay raise. If you remember from your history classes, it was called the trickle-down theory. Okay? The trickle-down theory, I don't know. I don't know if it's really worked. I think supply-side policies have been effective in creating increased output and lower price levels. One of the reasons that we've had significantly lower inflation during your lifetime than we had when I was in high school is partly because of these supply-side policies. Okay? But one of the things that deregulation has done and these other supply-side policies have done is they've helped widen the gap between the rich and the poor. And we talked about that back in chapter 13, I think it was, maybe it was 12. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. During this pandemic, okay, obviously the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are getting poorer. They're not doing as well. Okay? But the people at the top are now able to buy stocks at lower prices. They're going to be able to buy businesses at a bargain price. So the people at the top are benefiting more from these supply side policies than the people in the middle or on the bottom. So two basic ideas to fix the economy. Demand side policies are based upon John Maynard Keynes' shift the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Supply side policies, or Reaganomics as they were called in the media, are designed to fix the economy by shifting aggregate supply. Okay? Those are both government stabilization policies. They're what the government can do. The government can increase or decrease government spending. They can change tax rates to influence the economy. But the other group that we said in the last chapter, and they also bring it up again in this chapter, is monetary policy. The Federal Reserve, or the Fed, has the ability to change the aggregate supply or aggregate demand curves as well through monetary policy. If the economy is in a recession, we learned last chapter that the Fed is likely to follow an easy money policy. Under an easy money policy, the supply of money goes up. The Fed pumps money into circulation. Well, how do people respond with all that extra money? Well, they want to buy more goods and services. So what does an easy money policy do? What does an easy money policy do to this graph? Well, an easy money policy causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right, because people will respond to lower interest rates by borrowing and spending more. Same with businesses. Businesses, if they can borrow the money at a low rate, will spend more money, and that will cause the economy to grow, which is the purpose behind an easy money policy. But as we mentioned in the last chapter, an easy money policy does what to prices? Eventually, it's going to cause prices to rise. And that's the balancing act that the Fed is constantly involved with. In the short term, they want to move interest rates to try to move the economy. They want to lower interest rates and speed up the economy by shifting the aggregate demand curve. But if they do this repeatedly, that's going to cause higher prices. And we talked, the analogy I used last chapter was the tightrope. The Fed is constantly balancing between short-term lowering interest rates and long-term prices. Okay? When the economy was facing incredible inflation, 12, 13, 14% a year when I was in high school, 1978, 79, 80, 81, I graduated in 1982, the Fed was faced with, or the economy was faced with tremendous inflation. So what kind of a monetary policy did the Fed follow? The Fed followed a tight money policy, and higher interest rates do the exact opposite. They discourage people from spending. Okay? And that causes the economy to go down. But it does help with prices. And that was the problem they were trying to fight. Okay? So the Fed also can try to fix the economy. So as we face this pandemic-induced recession, okay, and the unemployment numbers came out the other day, 14.7%, the highest unemployment our country has had since the Great Depression. And unfortunately, I think it could continue to get worse. Although as I'm recording this, they've opened up the golf courses and they're starting to open up a few more of the businesses. But there's no way they're going to get back to normal capacity anytime soon. And so the Fed and the federal government, the Federal Reserve and the federal government through fiscal policy and the Federal Reserve through monetary policy are trying to fix the economy. Okay? All right, that covers chapter 15, section 2. There's really not much of importance in section 3. I hope you read it, but there's nothing on the quiz from section 3. So if you didn't, no harm, no foul. Next week, we're going to be talking about investing. I think it's one of the most important chapters. Okay? We're going to learn about how to become a millionaire. I told you the very first day I would show you how to become a millionaire through investing. Okay? And right now, the stock market has been going up and down a lot. And you might think, well, that's a scary time. But this is actually the best time to be investing in stocks. So make sure you tune in next week and learn about investing as we learn how to become a millionaire. Don't forget to take the quizzes using the textbook. If you're trying to improve your grade, remember you can improve your grades, one letter grade, if you're getting an 80% on all these quizzes. You do have to turn in the quiz by Saturday night, midnight. Okay, you don't get to turn them in 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. Okay? Until next week, stay safe and good luck.